We're going to start working with high-res objects now. We're going to work inside of 3dsMax for the moment. Later on we'll jump into ZBrush. I'm going to show you how to use the normal mapping tools inside of 3dsMax to go ahead and get this stuff done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up an example scene here. I'm going to open up the scene called 9 Start. All we see now is this high-res object that's down here. And what this is a simple object with a turbo smooth operator modifier on top of it. So you can see it, the viewport's extremely slow. This object is very, very high res. If I switch over to wireframe, you can see that the wireframe is extremely dense. Okay, it's got a turbo smooth operator with 4 iterations. It's very, very high res. This object, it would be very impractical to take this object into a game engine. It simply will not work. This object is just too high res. It's got too many polygons, which is no good. But it's got a lot of detail. Would be great, wouldn't it, if we could just take the detail from this and put it on a low res object? Well, we actually can through normal mapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy here just so it doesn't slow down our viewport, and I'm going to make some changes to it. I'm going to go to its object properties. One thing you could do to improve viewport performance is to turn on backface cull. That'll help a little bit. Basically, it'll turn off all the faces that are on the other side. You can see my viewport's already a little bit faster. Not much faster, but a bit. What I'm going to do now is turn on my snapping. Make sure I have grid point snapping on. I'm going to create myself a low-res object, a simple plain object. And I'm going to make it about the size of this object here. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to take this object. I'm going to take the segments here and set it to 1. I'm going to convert this to an editable poly. Okay. Now this object has UVs by default, which is actually very important. Another important thing about normal mapping is you need to make sure that the low-res object matches the high-res object as closely as possible, and that they are both occupying the same exact amount of space would be ideal. But you know, obviously the high-res and low-res objects are different. So as long as they occupy a similar amount of space, it's fine. So if you were, normal mapping, say, a character's head, you would want to make sure that the low-res head and the high-res head have about the same proportions, the same size, they're located in the same place in 3D space and all that kind of stuff. So here I place this right inside of this high-res object, okay? And with that done, all I need to do is go over to my rendering menu and activate render to texture. Shortcut is 0. Okay, so let me go over some of the settings here. Let me close all these rollouts. We have a lot of rollouts here in the render to texture window. So the main important settings under general settings is the output path where you're going to be saving this stuff to. Also, render frame window is just going to pop up the render frame window, which is this window right here when you render out. You can also choose some render settings, so some presets and things like that. And we can also open up the render setup window over here, which I'll talk about more in a moment. In objects to bake, this is pretty important. We can save and load object presets that you create. In this case, we don't have any presets to load up. Here we have an array showing what's going to be normal map, the low-res objects basically. And under projection mapping, this is actually pretty important. This is where we tell 3dsMax which object is the high-res object that we're going to extract details from. Okay? So what you want to do here is click on the pick button, and then in the add targets window you can select the high-res object, which is going to be this sample panel. So I'm going to click on add, and it's going to load it up as the high-res object. And now you can see that this automatically turns on. The enabled flag over here turns on. All these options are set up for us automatically. No need to mess around with those. You also notice that there's this sort of purple wireframe here. That's the actual cage that's used by Max to calculate the normal map. Okay, so if I click on the options button here, I'm going to get this projection options window. So there's a whole bunch of different settings here that I can tinker around with. The default settings I find that work pretty good. The main setting here to look out for is down here, the normal map space. Normal map space is very important. For most games, you usually want to go with tangent space, which is the default. That'll work out just fine. All these other settings are more advanced settings. I would leave those at default and not mess around with those. I like using the ray trace method with the use cage on. And under global super sampler, this is probably the other important setting here you want to play around with. Right now it's set to none. What that means is that this is going to render out pretty fast, but the quality is not going to be that great. And I'll show you how to fix the quality later on. we go down here to mapping coordinates, this is also very important. This is going to control the UV mapping. Now this object already has UVs, so I'm not going to mess with the UVs, but if for whatever reason you want to unwrap this automatically, you can choose to use automatic unwrap, and then under the automatic mapping rollout, you can choose your settings down here. I'm going to leave it on use existing channel and for object and sub objects. So the next rollout is the output rollout. This one's really important. You need to tell 3dsMax what it is that you're going to be outputting when you render out. So I'm going to click on add, and you can output lots of different things: a complete map, a specular map, diffuse map, a lighting map. We want to go with a normals map, so I'm going to click on add elements, and then I can also choose where I'm going to save this out. So I'm going to save it out right here. I'm just going to call it panel normal map, and I'm going to save it as a JPEG. I think a JPEG will work out just fine. And under target map slot, I'm going to go with bump, and then down here under the size, this is very important. The smaller the size, the lower quality the normal map is going to be, but the faster it's going to render out. Okay, so that's something to take into consideration. For test rendering, I like to use something like maybe 512. That's pretty good for test rendering. Under baked material, you can output this into source, or you could say to create a shell and save the source material. Basically create this whole new network of materials for you. I'm just going to leave it on output into source, and that's it. Down here we can hit render to render this out, or unwrap only. If you were using automatic mapping settings, you can unwrap it only. But in this case, I'm just going to go with render. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out. And it's going to render out relatively quickly. It's only a 512 map. You can see it rendered out pretty quick, and we have our rendered preview window here. You can see here that there's a lot of artifacting. The edges look really bad. It doesn't look too great. So let me actually close that window. What I want to do now is I want to show you a preview of this. There's two ways we can preview this. We can preview the normal map in the real-time viewport, or we can preview it by rendering out with Mental Ray or the default scanline renderer. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to elect to go for a real-time preview. And another thing I want to do is I want to get rid of this high-res object. It's in my way, and I really don't want to look at it right now. So I'm going to go to the quad menu, Object Properties, and I'm going to display this as box. That way it's not in my way anymore. I'm going to select this guy again, and I'm going to go to the material editor over here. I'm just going to pull this up over here. Okay. This is the plane material. You can see the normal map is actually right here, which is fantastic. And if I go to this and I view the image, you can see what the image looks like. It's got some artifacting, not the best normal map. You can see that the edges and stuff have a lot of artifacting, a lot of jagged edges and stuff, and I'll show you how to fix that in a moment. I'm going to double click on the shader here on the material itself, and under DirectX Manager what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and load up the Metal Bump 9, and I'm going to hit Enable Plugin Material. Okay. Now there's a little bug here in Max 2011. When I do that, there's supposed to be a rollout that pops up right here that lets me change my DirectX material settings, but as you can see, it didn't appear. This is a little bug here with 3dsMax 2011. To fix it is actually pretty simple. Let's go back to this material here. What you need to do is double click on any other node to load up its settings over here, and then go back to the material. And now you'll notice that magically this DirectX Shader Metal Bump 9 rollout just appears out of nowhere. So there you go, little funny glitch, but that's how you fix it. I'm going to go here to normal, turn that on. I'm going to go here to my map selection, and I'm going to choose the normal map. Let me go back down here. You can see it, the normal map now appears in the viewport. The object's got this funny blue color. So what I can do is turn on specular. I'm going to go to the diffuse color, drop the diffuse down a little bit, maybe change the color up a little bit here, make it look a little more interesting. Okay. And another thing that I can do is create some lights. So let me actually go here to the creation panel. I'm going to go to lights, and let me create standard light. I'm going to create a simple Omni light, and you can see it, the Omni light reacts with the normal light, the normal map, very, very well. So if I create a couple of lights over here, you can see how these lights react with my object and just make it look a lot more interesting. If you move these lights around in a real-time viewport, you can see that the normal map added all the detail from the high-res object onto the low-res object. This is extremely useful for doing these kinds of things. This is great for doing details for your environments and things like that in your game. It's just an awesome way of working. Now, in terms of the quality right now is really bad, so we need to fix that. So I'm going to select the object, the low-res object, and what I'm going to do is to increase the quality, we need to do a couple of things. One, increase the resolution of the actual normal map. So I'm going to increase it to a 1K. You can also go with like a 2K. That'll look pretty good too. I'm going to go with 1K. Works out fine right now. Remember that increasing the size will in fact increase render time. Under Global Super Sampler over here, I'm going to go to Setup, and I'm going to go over here and enable Global Super Sampler. As soon as we use one of these Super Samplers, we're going to get ourselves a better quality normal map. Using the Max 2.5 star sampler will work out pretty good. You can also use one of these other ones. I'm going to use Adaptive Halting. That one seems to work out pretty good as well. So I'm going to close that, and you can see now the Global Super Sampler is Adaptive Halting right there. So I'm going to close that. And that's it. I'm going to hit Render. It's going to ask me if I want to overwrite the previous file. I'm going to hit yes. It's going to start to render this thing out. And it's going to take a little while to render simply because the object or the render itself is higher quality. So we're going to get something that looks a lot better than before. But it's going to take a little bit longer to render. We can already see that the edges are nice and crisp. Looks very high res, very nice. I'm going to skip ahead in the video so you don't have to watch this process. Okay, so it finished up. Let me close that. And now you can see in the viewport, I already have a much nicer looking normal map. You can see it, the map looks a lot nicer. It's more high res. If I open up the Slate Material Editor and I go to the map itself and go to View Image, you can see that this big 1K image looks fantastic. It's very crisp, very clear. You can see we don't have those jagged edges anymore. The Global Super Sampler ended up doing a great job. And that's pretty much it. So let me close this. Alright, so that's it. That's pretty much normal mapping in a nutshell. Taking the high resolution details from a high res object, putting them on a low res object like this plane, which is only comprised of one polygon or two triangles. And that's it. You can make a game that looks more detailed than it actually is and performs very well.